The crystal blue water shimmered, ready. The first guest arrived, a smile on their face. Then a single entitled declaration, "This is my pool now." The look of pure shock on their face as the water began to drain. A party prepared for a line crossed. It was the only way to make it stow. The Saturday air, thick with the scent of grilling burgers and freshly mown grass, hummed with a quiet, anticipatory energy. For David, this was more than just a party. It was a victory lap. The promotion at work, the final payment on the pool installation, it all culminated in this moment. His backyard, usually a peaceful green square, was transformed into a vibrant haven. A dozen string lights crisscrossed overhead, casting a warm, golden glow on the manicured lawn. The centerpiece, of course, was the pool. It was a shimmering, rectangular jewel of cerulean, its surface as smooth and inviting as polished glass. He had spent the last 2 days meticulously balancing the chemicals and skimming the surface for the smallest leaf. As he adjusted the volume on the outdoor speakers, a shadow fell over him. "Dave, don't you look happy?" a saccharine voice cooed from the patio gate. It was Karen, his next-door neighbor, a woman whose every interaction felt less like a conversation and more like a carefully orchestrated power play. She stood with her son Leo, a boy of 10 who carried himself with the entitled swagger of a trust fund baby. They weren't invited. "Karen," David said, his smile tightening. "I didn't know you were coming over." "Oh, we're not staying long," she replied, a patronizing wave of her hand dismissing his unspoken question. "Just wanted to say hi before your guests arrive." David nodded, hoping she'd take the hint and leave. He glanced at his watch. His first guests, his best friend Mark and his wife Sarah, were due any minute. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back. But it had nothing to do with the heat. It was the familiar, cloying anxiety that always accompanied Karen's presence. Leo, meanwhile, had wandered off. David's eyes followed the boy, his heart rate quickening as Leo's gaze locked onto the pool. He could almost see the chaotic, destructive gears turning in the boy's head. "Careful, Leo," David called out, his voice firm but friendly. "The party hasn't officially started yet. The water's a little chilly." Karen scoffed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping a rhythm on her phone. "Oh, please, Dave, he's fine. He's just a boy. You're being so uptight." Before David could respond, Leo did the unthinkable. He ran to the edge of the pool, kicked off his sandals, and with a triumphant whoop, cannonballed into the water. The serene surface erupted in a chaotic explosion of spray. David's jaw clenched. A perfect, clean pool, now a churning vortex of water and chlorine. A wave of frustration, hot and sharp, washed over him. He had spent weeks dreaming of this moment, of dipping his toes into the cool water after a long day of work, of watching his friends laugh as they floated on the rafts. That dream was now tainted. He strode to the edge of the pool. Leo was doggy paddling, a smug grin plastered on his face. "See, Mom?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the patio wall. "I told you it was awesome. This is my pool now." The words hit David like a physical blow. My pool. The arrogance. The pure unadulterated entitlement. This was the exact reason he had built a privacy fence between their yards. "Leo, get out of the pool," David said, his voice low and dangerous. Karen stepped up, her face a mask of faux concern. "Don't you yell at my son, David. It's just water. He was just so excited." "Excited or not, Karen, you don't just jump into someone's property without asking," David shot back. Leo scrambled out of the water and stood dripping on the edge, a tiny, defiant figure. "But he said it was my pool now," Karen said, her voice rising in pitch. "It's not his fault if you're a grumpy old man who doesn't want to share." David felt his face flush. "It's my pool, Karen. I paid for it. I built it. It's not a public park." Just then, Mark and Sarah arrived. Their smiling faces froze as they took in the scene. A dripping wet Leo, a scowling Karen, and a visibly fuming David. The festive music now felt like a cruel joke. "Everything okay, Dave?" Mark asked, his hand resting tentatively on David's shoulder. David forced a smile. "Just a slight misunderstanding. We're getting it sorted." Karen saw her opportunity. She adopted a more dramatic posture, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "Oh, it's just awful, Mark. David is being so mean to poor Leo just for wanting to enjoy the water. I've tried to explain that it's just a little splash, but he's so angry." The accusation was a finely honed blade, designed to cut David down in front of his friends. Mark and Sarah exchanged a confused, uncomfortable glance. They knew David. He was many things, but mean was not one of them. "Karen," Sarah began, her voice a calm counterpoint to the rising tension. "Maybe you should just take Leo home. The party is starting and—" "Take him home?" Karen shrieked, her facade of victimhood cracking. "After he's been so horribly treated? We are guests, you know." David's patience, a finite resource, was completely depleted. He looked at his pristine, now splashed and compromised pool. He looked at Karen's accusatory glare. He looked at Leo, who was now kicking at the pool ladder, dislodging a section of the rubber railing. The culmination of months of hard work, shattered by an uninvited brat and his entitled mother, a cold, deliberate rage settled over him, pushing out the frustration and anxiety. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a hostile takeover. Karen wasn't leaving, and Leo wasn't going to stop. David's mind, usually a whirl of what-ifs, went frighteningly still. He knew what he had to do. The consequences be damned. He walked past Karen and Leo, ignoring their protests. He walked past the now awkwardly silent Mark and Sarah. His steps were slow, methodical. He reached the side of the house where the pool pump was housed. He could hear Karen's voice trailing after him, a high-pitched demand for an apology. He knelt down and located the large red valve. It controlled the drainage. One turn and the water would begin to flow into the storm drain, leaving nothing behind. "What are you doing?" Karen shrieked, a new note of panic in her voice. The party guests, a small crowd now gathered at the gate, watched in silent confusion. David didn't answer. He simply put his hand on the valve. It was stiff at first, caked in dirt from the installation. He pushed harder, his muscles straining. The loud click was followed by a deep, sucking sound. A geyser of water erupted from a nearby pipe, a violent stream gushing toward the street. The once smooth surface of the pool began to ripple. The water level, almost imperceptibly at first, began to drop. The look on Karen's face was a masterpiece of emotional collapse. Her eyes widened, her mouth agape. The smugness, the entitlement, the patronizing superiority, it all drained away faster than the water in the pool. Her perfect, self-serving world, in which she was always right and everyone else was a lesser character, had just been upended. Her son, her little prince, who had just laid claim to his neighbor's property, now stood at the edge of a rapidly shrinking kingdom. She had called David uptight, and now, in front of a dozen witnesses, he was proving her right in the most spectacular, ironic way possible. And David, kneeling beside the pump, felt a grim satisfaction. He had lost his party, but he had gained a piece of his dignity back. And as the last of the celebratory burgers sizzled on the grill, the only sound anyone could hear was the steady, unrelenting roar of the draining water. The party guests, frozen in place at the patio gate, watched in a collective, bewildered silence. The festive music, still playing, felt grotesquely out of place against the sound of gushing water. It was a cacophony of celebration and destruction, a soundtrack to David's carefully orchestrated act of defiance. Karen's theatrical shriek of a few seconds ago had been replaced by a choked, wheezing gasp. Her eyes, wide and horrified, darted from the now visible concrete floor of the pool to David, who remained kneeling by the pump, his face a mask of resolute fury. Leo, still a dripping mess at the poolside, finally registered what was happening. His entitled smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer gut-wrenching betrayal. "Mommy!" he whined, his voice high-pitched and panicked. "The water's gone!" Karen didn't respond. She just stared at David, her hands clenching and unclenching, at her sides, as if she was trying to form the words to express her outrage but couldn't find them. All of her carefully cultivated social power, the polite but patronizing tone, the manipulative body language, the feigned victimhood, was useless against the simple, brutal reality of the draining water. David had changed the rules of the game. He wasn't playing for public opinion anymore. He was playing for his sanity. Mark and Sarah, who had been trying to de-escalate the situation just moments before, now stood in stupefied awe. Mark's mouth was slightly agape. "Dave," he whispered, as if he was afraid of shattering the moment. "What are you—" David finally stood up, his gaze locked on Karen. His clothes were still pristine, his hair neatly combed, but something in his posture had shifted. He was no longer the overwhelmed host, he was the avenger. "This is my pool," he said, his voice as steady and cold as a slab of marble. "Not his, not yours. And it seems like the only way to get that point across is to make sure it's not anyone's." Karen finally found her voice, and it came out as a scream. "You crazy man! You've ruined your own property. You've ruined your party." "You ruined my party the second you walked through that gate," David replied, his voice never rising. He gestured to the guests still standing, frozen at the entrance. "And you proved your point. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to figure out what to do with a dozen guests and a very empty hole in the ground." He turned to Mark and Sarah, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry, guys. We can order pizzas or something. Or we can reschedule." Mark, an old friend who had seen David at his most stressed out and his most celebratory, simply shook his head and offered a small, knowing smile. "Pizza sounds good, Dave. I think we're all going to need a drink after this." The other guests, sensing the drama was over but the tension was not, began to disperse, muttering to each other as they left. The silent, judging gaze of the neighborhood was the last thing David saw before the gate clicked shut. Karen, however, remained. Her face was a storm of raw emotion, disbelief, fury, and a flicker of something that might have been fear. Leo, finally breaking free from his daze, began to cry, loud, theatrical sobs that were clearly meant to be a weapon. "You're a monster!" Karen sobbed, her hands covering her face. "You made my little boy cry?" David crossed his arms. "I didn't make him do anything, Karen. He jumped in the pool. You stood by and watched, and then he claimed it as his own. I've been trying to be a good neighbor for a year, but you have no concept of boundaries." He looked down at Leo, whose cries were getting louder, more desperate. The boy wasn't just upset about the water. He was upset that the universe, which had always bent to his will, had suddenly turned on him. "I'm calling the police," Karen said, her voice trembling. "This is destruction of property. This is a criminal act." David let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "My property? You're calling the police for destroying my property? Go ahead, Karen. Tell them how my neighbor, Karen, and her son, Leo, decided to crash a party they weren't invited to, and how the boy called my pool his own, and how I responded by doing something perfectly legal on my own property." Karen, faced with the cold, hard logic of his statement, faltered. Her phone, which she had been brandishing like a weapon, lowered slightly. She knew deep down that calling the police would only make her look like a fool. "This isn't over, David," she hissed, her voice a poisonous whisper. "You'll regret this." She grabbed Leo by the arm, who was still wailing, and dragged him away, the sound of his sobs growing fainter as they disappeared into her house. The gate slammed shut behind them with a final, echoing thud. For a long moment, David stood alone in his yard. The only sounds were the soft hum of the empty grill and the continuous rushing roar of the draining water. The shimmering jewel was gone, replaced by a deep, dark hole. The party, the symbol of his success and his happiness, was over before it began. He felt a sudden, profound exhaustion. The adrenaline that had propelled him to the valve was gone, leaving him hollow. He turned to Mark and Sarah, who were now standing on the patio, watching him with a mixture of concern and admiration. "So," David said, running a hand through his hair. "Pizza?" Sarah nodded, a small, genuine smile on her face. "Definitely. Pizza. And Dave? You know, I don't think you ruined the party. I think you just started a much better one." Just as they were about to head inside, David's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, a text message from an unknown number. He opened it, and his blood ran cold. It was a picture of him, taken from a high angle. It showed him kneeling by the pump, his hand on the valve. The caption, a single line of text, was scrawled across the bottom of the photo. "Some people just can't share. No kid zone or pool fail." The picture wasn't taken by any of the guests. It was taken from an upstairs. The silence in David's living room was heavier than the air outside. The sound of the draining water was now a faint, distant rush, but the low hum of the air conditioning seemed to amplify the tension. David sat on his couch, phone in hand, staring at the message from the unknown number. Mark and Sarah stood behind him, looking over his shoulder at the grainy, damning photo. "She's fast," Sarah said, her voice laced with disbelief. "She's already turned this into a whole thing." The post, which David now saw on his local neighborhood Facebook group, was already gaining traction. Karen's carefully crafted caption, "Some people just can't share." "No kid zone, yash pool fail," was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. The comments were a mixed bag, but the initial ones were all in Karen's favor. "OMG, that's terrible. Draining a whole pool just because a kid jumped in? What's wrong with people? The entitlement of some neighbors is just shocking. Kids are going to be kids. I can't believe David would do something like that. He always seems so nice. Must be a different person when the cameras are off." A wave of cold dread washed over David. This wasn't fair. The picture told none of the story. The uninvited guests, Leo's disrespectful declaration, the complete and utter lack of boundaries. It was just a photo of a man looking angry and vengeful, draining his own pool. Out of context, his action looked monstrous. Mark, ever the pragmatist, leaned in closer. "Okay, David, what's her angle here? What does she want?" "She doesn't want anything," David said, his voice a low growl. "She just wants to make me look like a jerk. She wants to be the victim, to win the court of public opinion. It's what she does." "You have to respond," Sarah urged. "You can't just let this stand. People who don't know you are going to believe her." David scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "And what am I supposed to say? I'm sorry, but my neighbor's kid is an entitled brat and I snapped and drained my 1,000-gallon pool? That's not going to win me any fans." Mark took the phone from David, scrolling through the comments. No, you don't apologize. You state the facts. You tell your side of the story." "And get into a Facebook fight with her?" David said, standing up and pacing the length of the living room. "That's what she wants. She'll just spin everything I say and make me look even worse. She's a professional at this. I'm just a guy who wanted to have a party and ended up with an empty hole in the ground." His anger was now a helpless, simmering frustration. The satisfaction he had felt kneeling by the valve was completely gone, replaced by the bitter reality that his act of defiance, so cathartic in the moment, was now a digital weapon aimed directly at him. "Look, you're not wrong," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "You can't get into a comment war, but you can do something else. You can own the narrative." David stopped pacing. "Own the narrative?" How? You make a post, Mark said, handing the phone back to him. But not just text. You make a video. David looked at him confused. A video? Of what? The empty pool? Exactly, Sarah said, a glint of an idea in her eyes. But it's not a video of you complaining. It's a video of you explaining, calmly, rationally, with humor even. You stand in front of that empty pool and you tell them what happened, from your perspective. No yelling, no insults, just facts. The idea, so simple in its execution, felt impossibly difficult. David had never been one for confrontation, and certainly not for putting himself on display. He was a private person. But as he looked at Karen's post and the tide of negative comments, he knew he had no choice. She had forced his hand. They went outside. The grill, now cold, stood sentinel over the barren concrete bowl. The string lights, which had promised so much joy, now simply illuminated the defeat. Mark set his phone up on a tripod. David stood at the edge of the empty pool, his back to the house, his posture straight and serious. "Ready?" Mark asked. David took a deep breath. "Ready." He pressed record. "Hey, everyone," David began, his voice a little shaky at first, but gaining confidence as he went. "If you're seeing this, you've probably seen the post that's been floating around from my neighbor. The one about my pool. I want to explain what happened from my side of things." He gestured to the empty pool behind him. "This beautiful pool was supposed to be the venue for a party today, celebrating a promotion and a new chapter in my life. It was a big deal for me. I worked hard for it. I paid for it. It was my private property." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "Before the party officially started, my neighbor came over, uninvited, with her son. Her son, without asking, without permission, decided to jump in the pool. When I told him to get out, he yelled, 'This is my pool now.'" David's voice remained calm, but the anger was a low, steady current beneath the words. "I tried to de-escalate. I tried to reason with his mother. But she stood there and told me I was being a grumpy old man for not wanting to share my new property with her entitled son." He took a step closer to the edge. "I stood there, watching the very thing I had worked for and was so proud of, being disrespected. And in that moment, I made a choice. I could have let them win. I could have let them take over my party, my property, my day." He looked directly into the camera. "Or I could stand my ground. And so I turned a valve and I emptied the pool." He gestured to the empty space with a wry smile. "So, yes, it's true. I drained the pool. I ruined my own party. But in doing so, I protected my property, my boundaries, and my sanity. And for me, that's a win. I guess some people just can't understand that." He turned back to Mark, who gave him a thumbs up. Sarah was already editing the video, cutting out the brief moments of silence. She attached a screenshot of the message Karen had sent him. "It's proof," she said. "It shows what this is really about." They posted the video. The first few comments were from Karen's supporters, doubling down on their accusations. "You're pathetic. Crying to the internet because a kid splashed in your pool. The backstory makes it even worse. So petty." But then, the comments started to shift. People who were on the fence, people who had been manipulated by Karen's initial post, began to see the other side. "Okay, watching this, I get it. It's about more than the pool. Good for you, David. Boundaries are important. This guy is a hero. That kid sounds like a nightmare." David watched the tide turn, a grim, weary smile on his face. He hadn't won the war yet, but he had just won the first major battle. As his phone buzzed with more and more notifications, and as the positive comments began to outnumber the negative ones, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Karen was not going to take this public defeat lightly, and he knew with a certainty that made his blood run cold that her next move would be far more personal than a social media post. David woke up the next morning feeling the unfamiliar lightness of a small victory. The draining water had finally ceased its roar sometime in the early hours, replaced by a profound, almost eerie silence. His phone, which he had silenced for the night, was buzzing with notifications. He unlocked it to find a flood of support. The video had gone viral within their small community, spreading far beyond the neighborhood Facebook group. Complete strangers were commenting, sharing their own Karen stories, and commending his stand. "You handled that with so much class, David. Boundaries are everything." "I just showed this to my husband. We're both cheering for you." The look on her face when the water started draining. Pure gold. This is the definition of karma. He even received a few direct messages from neighbors he barely knew, all expressing their support and sharing their own quiet grievances about Karen's behavior over the years. The public shaming had backfired on her in a spectacular way, and David felt a surge of satisfaction. He had stood his ground, and for once the good guy had won. He showered, dressed for work, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about standing up to a bully. As he drove to his office, he imagined the look on Karen's face when she saw her post being used as a cautionary tale. He arrived at his desk, his mind already on the next phase of his plan. A call to the pool company to arrange for a refill and a thorough cleaning. The hole in the ground would be a symbol of his resolve, and he would take pride in rebuilding it. His phone buzzed. An internal email from his boss, Mr. Thompson. The subject line was terse. Meeting request. The body was even more so. "David, please come to my office at your earliest convenience. This is urgent." A cold dread seeped into David's veins. Mr. Thompson was a man who preferred to handle business over the phone or with a casual chat at the coffee machine. A formal, urgent meeting request was highly unusual and rarely a good sign. David's newfound confidence began to crack. He walked to the corner office, the click of his shoes on the polished tile echoing in the sudden silence of his own thoughts. Mr. Thompson, a man in his 50s with a sharp haircut and an even sharper mind, was already waiting. He gestured for David to sit down, his face a neutral, unreadable mask. "David," Mr. Thompson began, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "I'm glad you came right away. I've received some very concerning information this morning." David's heart was now a frantic drum against his ribs. "What kind of information, sir?" Mr. Thompson tapped a tablet on his desk. "An anonymous email was sent to me, to HR, and to several members of our senior leadership. It contains a link to a social media post, as well as a short narrative of what transpired." David's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what he was talking about. He had a sudden, terrifying vision of Karen hunched over her laptop, her face twisted in a sneer of triumph as she crafted the most damaging, out-of-context narrative she could. Mr. Thompson continued, oblivious to David's internal panic. "The email alleges that you displayed a serious lack of judgment and an unhinged, violent temper in a neighborhood dispute. It claims that you engaged in reckless destruction of property and were abusive towards a minor child." The words were like bullets, each one a twist on the truth, designed to make him sound unhinged and dangerous. The description of his violent temper was a far cry from the cool, calculated resolve he had felt. Abusive towards a minor child was the most vicious lie of all. Karen had weaponized every single part of the incident. "Sir, that's not what happened," David said, his voice pleading. "I can explain. The email is from my neighbor who I've had issues with." "I'm aware of that," Mr. Thompson said, his gaze fixed on David's. "The email also attached a screenshot of a second social media post you made, a video where you admit to draining the pool." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We have a very strict code of conduct here, David. We pride ourselves on hiring individuals with sound judgment and emotional control. This behavior, regardless of the circumstances, raises some serious questions about your suitability for a leadership position, especially so soon after your promotion. The words hit David with the force of a physical blow. Karen wasn't just looking for public validation, she was trying to destroy his life. She was using his professional achievements as leverage, twisting a private dispute into an act of professional misconduct. The pool was no longer the centerpiece of the drama. His career was. David's mind reeled, his carefully constructed video, his public victory, now a tool in her hands. He had thought he won the battle, but he had just walked right into a far more dangerous war. The silence in Mr. Thompson's office was more deafening than a scream. The words hung in the air, heavy with a weight David couldn't quite grasp. Serious questions about your suitability for a leadership position. It was the corporate version of a death sentence. A perfectly polite way of saying Karen's anonymous email had already done its damage. "Sir, with all due respect," David said, his voice strained, "I was defending my property from an uninvited guest. The email and her initial post are a gross misrepresentation of what happened." Mr. Thompson held up a hand. "I understand your frustration, David. Believe me, I do. But this isn't about who is right or wrong in a neighborhood dispute. This is about perception. Your post, your video, it went viral, yes, but not in a way that is beneficial to our brand. We saw the comments. Unstable, immature, childish. These are not the qualities we look for in our senior managers." David felt a hot, helpless anger rising in his throat. But what about her? What about the person who lied and started this whole thing? "She did not use our company's platform to air her grievances," Mr. Thompson replied, his tone sharp. "You did. The email sent to us was anonymous. But your video, in which you admit to the act, is a public record. It is now linked to your professional identity. Whether or not her claims are true is irrelevant. The perception that they might be true is enough." A sudden, sick feeling settled in David's stomach. He had walked into a trap of his own making. He had thought he was a hero, a master of a digital chess match. But he had just given Karen the ammunition she needed to fire a real bullet. The irony was so bitter it was like acid on his tongue. He had felt so powerful, so righteous, and now he was completely powerless in the face of a corporate policy designed to protect image above all else. Mr. Thompson's expression softened slightly, as if he could see the light of comprehension dawning in David's eyes. "Look, David, this is what's going to happen. We are putting your promotion on hold indefinitely. Effective immediately, you are on administrative leave with pay while we conduct a full review of the incident. We need to determine if you can still be a leader here, or if this incident reflects a fundamental lack of judgment that we can't afford to ignore." David stared at him, his mind reeling. Administrative leave. It was just a phrase, a corporate formality, but it felt like a brand of shame. It was a sign to his colleagues that he was in trouble, a scarlet letter for his career. "But I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I hope that's the case, David. But in this day and age, perception is reality. I'm sorry." The meeting was over. David stood up, his legs feeling like lead, and walked out of the office. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He just went to his desk, grabbed his laptop bag, and left. The faces of his colleagues, a blur of confusion and hushed whispers, felt like a silent jury, already passing their verdict. He drove. Home in a daze, the victory from the morning a distant, mocking echo. He had felt so good, so proud. He had thought he was finally free of Karen's tyranny. But she had been one step ahead, always. While he was celebrating a public win, she was laying the groundwork for a personal, professional attack. He had no idea how deep her malice went. He pulled into his driveway. The empty pool, a gaping blue wound in the middle of his yard, greeted him like a monument to his folly. The water was gone, but the emptiness had now spread to fill every corner of his life. He felt hollowed out, defeated. His perfect Saturday party was nothing but a memory, and now his perfect career was in jeopardy. He stumbled to his front door, his hands fumbling for the key. As he did, he noticed a small white envelope sticking out of his mailbox. It wasn't a bill. It was thick, a formal, professional envelope with a crisp, embossed seal. It looked official. David's heart, already. A frantic drum now slammed against his ribs. He pulled it out and tore it open. The letterhead was stark and professional. The law offices of Patterson, Riley and Associates. He unfolded the paper. The words swam before his eyes at first, a blur of legalese and jargon. But then a few lines jumped out at him, a clear, "and present danger" written in black and white. R.E. Demand for compensation, civil harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Your outrageous and malicious conduct towards our client, Mrs. Karen Sterling. The willful destruction of property and the intentional emotional distress caused to her minor son, Leo Sterling. We will proceed with a civil action for damages and petition for a restraining order. David's hand shook, the paper rattling in his grip. This wasn't a social media feud. This wasn't a corporate policy review. This was a real legal threat. Karen wasn't just trying to shame him. She was trying to sue him, to bankrupt him, to silence him with the full weight of the legal system. She was not just a bully, she was an enemy. He had emptied the pool to reclaim his property, but now he was facing the prospect of losing everything he had worked for. He looked at the letter, and then at the house next door, at the silent, watching windows of Karen's home. The battle had just moved from the backyard to the courtroom, and David realized with a horrifying, gut-wrenching certainty that he was already on the defensive. He hadn't just drained his pool. He had drained his own life savings and peace of mind into a cold, empty hole.